All right, everyone. Thanks for joining this morning or afternoon if you're in Europe. We appreciate it. Just to introduce myself briefly, I am Ethan Jones. I work on product here at WireMock, and today's session will be led by Dan Perovich, who is in charge of all things customer success here at WireMock. So today we're going to go through a new feature, specifically Git, and then we're going to have an open Q&A for anything you want to talk about related to WireMock. So the way these sessions are going to work is about once a month or so, we're going to take some time to show you something new or something that's already in the product that maybe hasn't gotten enough attention. But then the Q&A part doesn't need to be limited to just that feature. We're happy to use this as just kind of an open session to talk about anything you want. So make sure to raise any questions you have. You can use the Q&A section in Zoom there, and we'll make sure we cover your questions before we wrap up today. We'll also email this recording out after the call. And if you have any questions, we're happy to also connect in a one-on-one session to discuss anything we didn't get to live today. All right, so I'll hand it over to Dan and we can get started.
Great. Thanks, Ethan. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you today. My name's Dan Perovich. I run customer success and sales engineering here at WireMock, and happy to be showing you today our functionality around syncing your mock APIs with Git. So let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. First, at this point, you should be seeing a little glimpse of documentation on our OpenAPI Git integration. So you'll find this at docs.wiremock.io, covering what we'll be reviewing today, some tips and tricks as well for things like handling conflicts. And you'll be able to find this underneath the OpenAPI section of the documentation. With that said, let's hop over into WireMock. And here we have WireMock Cloud. I'll be using this WireMock Live OpenAPI mock API today. I do want to point out that this capability is specific to the OpenAPI template style in WireMock Cloud, and you will not be able to find this Git sync within the blank template. So again, this is applicable to the OpenAPI template today. So I have a pre-configured mock API here, showcasing a couple of the features of the OpenAPI template in WireMock Cloud. We've got two GET transaction stubs here and two posts demonstrating a little bit of variety in the body and matching styles as well as the response styles. If we come into the OpenAPI section here of WireMock Cloud, and inside of the settings tab, if we scroll down to the bottom, you'll be able to find our synchronize with a Git repository feature. Of course, you have your handy call out to open up the documentation page, as I showed you already. And we'll start by simply enabling this against a GitHub repositories. So I'll enable this enable synchronization, and we're presented with some default configuration values. Now I have a repository here already set up, WireMock Cloud _Git, underneath my own personal handle here in GitHub. And the first thing that we'll do is we'll come up to the code section and we'll grab our SSH endpoint for this repository. So I'll simply copy that to my clipboard. I'll come back over to WireMock Cloud and specify that in the Git address. Now we can specify which branch we want to interact with, as well as the path to the OpenAPI file. For simplicity's sake, I'm simply going to have that in the parent folder of our project here inside of GitHub for OpenAPI. Our next step here is to copy this public key. So I'll use this little copy to clipboard here, and we'll hop over into GitHub again and come into our project settings. Inside of our project settings, we can then go down to our deploy keys, and we can add a new deploy key. We'll give this a name, WireMock Cloud Sync for now. We'll specify that key, and then we'll ensure to enable this write access with this particular deployment key. Now, I've already authenticated once today using my two-factor authentication, but don't be surprised if you are prompt for two-factor authentication when you do this. At this point, we can come back over to WireMock Cloud and hit our test connection. And we should see rather quickly whether or not our connection is successful. So did we supply this deployment key appropriately for the project that sits at this Git address? And we can see that this tested successfully, and I can go ahead and save my settings here now. Now that we've got our configuration set up, let's go back over to our GitHub. We'll come into our code, and we'll see that we really have an empty project here, other than that I've used this before to show this demo a couple times. But right now we see nothing in the file tree happening. Back over to WireMock Cloud, we can scroll back up and come over to our document tab. Now, for many of those of you that are familiar with the OpenAPI capabilities inside the OpenAPI template, this OpenAPI document was generated automatically for me as I went through and created my mocks inside of my mock API. So this is an auto-generated OpenAPI document here. I can hit the push button, and upon hitting the push button, we can see I've got a successful check mark. Coming back over to back over to GitHub, and a simple refresh on my project should show that we now have an OpenAPI.yaml file that has been pushed to our GitHub repository. Opening that up, we can see that this is a like for like, exactly as it's stored inside of WireMock Cloud. Now, at this point, we have multiple options. We can continue to work inside of our WireMock Cloud environment, making changes to our prototyping here. Of course, in our settings of our OpenAPI screen, we have the capabilities to update our stubs when the OpenAPI changes. So this would mean that if anything changes in the OpenAPI document itself, the stubs will automatically be updated to reflect any of those changes. And it also works the other way, update OpenAPI document when the stubs change. So if we make a change to the stubs, we can have that document updated as well. Today, I actually want to show you, though, in the process of when we are doing parallel development, and maybe we've created this initial prototype design for a new mock API, we've synced our OpenAPI document into source code control, and now we have two teams that go off and use the assets separately. So our consuming team might be using this mock API to begin their consumer development, whether that's a front end or some other service that is requiring this yet to be developed API. And then, of course, we have the team that's going to continue to use this initial artifact, this OpenAPI document, to start to actually craft the API itself, to build that producer. Whether they do that in an IDE, use this OpenAPI document to generate the scaffolding and the method calls inside of their source code, or even load this into a tool like IBM's API Connect or MuleSoft or any other API product out there where development of this producer would continue to happen. Now, often what would happen, right, is our producing team continues to check in new changes to this OpenAPI document as well as the actual service itself. So let's go ahead and make a small change to this document here. And let's see, let's find something interesting. We'll take a look at this. Let's say it's a get here. Let me come down here. And let's say this organization, today when we first prototyped this, it was a string, but perhaps we want to change this to an integer now. And that'll be an integer, and the example here might be a 2. We'll commit these changes just through the UI here. And now we have our changes that have been published inside of our GitHub repository. Back inside of WireMock Cloud, coming back to the document section, we can certainly at this point do a poll to see if there's been any changes to that particular document that is stored inside of WireMock Cloud and referencing that against the GitHub version. And we can see with that simple pull that our organization has now been changed to a type of integer with an example of 2, just as it was saved in GitHub. Now, what I like to show in this case is one of those great features inside of the OpenAPI template is the validation sequence. So you can see that I have this set to hard validation mode. So imagine for a moment that our producing team has been actively building the backend code and has decided that it doesn't make sense to use a string when referencing the organization anymore, and that an ID should be used. However, our consuming team has been working against the mock API that came out of the design session and the early prototyping where that was a string. Now we can see, as they are using this particular stub with hard validation mode turned on, I'll use our test requester here, and we'll see, they're used to sending in a post with a first name, Richie, last name, new, in an organization with a string of finance. When we go ahead and we send this now, we can see that this is perfectly fine and happening here. And if I go ahead and change this to a 2, we can see here that our validation is triggering, right? Organization is 2, and that our OpenAPI schema validation has occurred, that our organization integer found and a string was expected in this section. Now what's happening here, right, is that we now have a mismatch of what is happening in that recently synced OpenAPI document versus how the mock is being used. We come back over and just double check that real quick. Coming back down into a get contact 2. Let's see. I actually did this in the get contact 2, where we were expecting a response of an integer. So let's do that one more time because I made a mistake. Mistakes happen, right? Where I really wanted to do this for my example for you was in the post. And unfortunately, I did that in the get. So let's go ahead and make one more change here. Let's go back down and find that post. So here's our post. Here's our posts to contacts. And we can see the example here where we have our organization expecting a string to be passed in with an example of finance. This is the one that I meant to edit, and I apologize for doing the wrong one, maybe confusing some of you all. So let's come back down here and make that edit like we did up above. So we can say that this is actually the integer, and the example here is going to be 2. We'll come back up to the top, and let's go ahead and change that back to what we had before, just so. Let's say it's marketing, and we can commit those changes one more time. Let's pull the sync like we did before. Go ahead and pull this, and let's make sure our changes are reflected there. So we can see our organization is back to a string with an example of marketing. And then here's our post, which is the one I initially intended to change. And we can see here the organization should now be an integer. Validating that our validation is set to hard validation, so I don't make another mistake here in my demonstration to you all. We can come back and say, okay, as we were originally consuming this, our consuming team was used to sending in an organization with a string of finance. At this point in time, when they actually send in and start using this mock with those recently checked in changes by the producing team, which says, nope, organization should now be an integer and not a string, we can see that WireMock does not fire off a false positive here, instead alerting the consuming team that they are now consuming the mock API in a way that is invalid according to the most current OpenAPI specification. In fact, that organization now is expected to be an integer instead of a string. So this is an example here of using that validation feature to make sure that any changes being synced from your Git repository back into WireMock Cloud can actually be validated against how the mock is being used. Now, of course, you have the flexibility to do this the way I just did this here, and with this validation tripping. You'll notice that on the generation page that I didn't have the stubs updated automatically because the OpenAPI changed. I have those turned off, and this in fact would be a best practice if we're relying on validation mode during CI/CD workflows to catch scenarios such as the one I demonstrated, where the producing team has changed the contract in a way that would break the way the consuming team had been consuming the mock APIs. Okay. And with that, I think that's all I really wanted to show today as far as the Git repository synchronization here. I'll open it up for any particular questions. As Ethan mentioned, these questions don't have to be specific to the Git repository synchronization that I showed today. They could be anything WireMock Cloud related. We're happy to treat this more as an Ask Me Anything session for the remainder of our 10 minutes here today. So feel free to use the Q&A panel inside of the WebEx here, or the Zoom webinar, I guess I should call it, and submit any questions you might have. Happy to help any way I can. Ethan, do we have anything queued up?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That was great. We do have a few questions here, so I will jump in, just looking through the list. You touched on this briefly, but what Git providers will this work for? Is it only GitHub? Will it work for GitHub Enterprise or Bitbucket? Do we know?
Great question. So the feature today, as it's released, works entirely with GitHub, and GitHub Enterprise would be supported as long as that connectivity path is there for an SSH session to be originated from WireMock Cloud servers to the GitHub repository, whether that be GitHub or GitHub Enterprise. So that SSH communication path needs to be open. Now, the feature is actually built on any Git-backed repository, which will enable us to support any source code control that operates on the underlying Git feature set. There may be a little bit of additional engineering that we would need to do to support any repositories that are not GitHub specific today. But that is something that our team would love to hear from our customers and our potential customers of what repositories you're using, so that we can in fact add full feature support for them.
Yep. So we built it to be very widely usable, not very bespoke for one specific provider. Any it doesn't work for, it sounds like just get in touch, and we're happy to close that last mile, and it should be a pretty light lift.
Absolutely.
Okay, we got another one here. What do I do if WireMock and Git fall out of sync for some reason?
Great question. So I can actually demonstrate this rather quickly. So let me come back in here. We'll make a small change in both our version that is stored inside of GitHub, as well as our OpenAPI document that is stored inside of WireMock. So if we come back and we change this back to a string, like we saw before, we'll put this back to marketing as well. We'll commit these changes. And at the same time, we can come into our document over here, and let's go ahead and make a different change. Let's change this contact ID on the get here to, let's go ahead and change this to a string. Right. And while this is not probably a completely valid OpenAPI spec, as we have a type of string and a format of int32 and an example that is an integer here, potentially string. Let's see what happens, right? Whether we do a push or a pull. So if we attempt to do a pull, here we can see that WireMock will alert us that you are out of sync with the remote repository. And in fact, if we do the push as well, we would see the exact same error message come up, or slightly different, but saying the same piece. It's telling us that the contents of our OpenAPI YAML on the branch that we're targeting is diverged from the copy of the OpenAPI document, as we see stored here in WireMock Cloud. And then it's asking us if we want to overwrite this mocks API current document with the repository file. So this is up to you on whether or not you want to overwrite the mock API's current document with the repository file, yes or no. The approach that we recommend is actually inside of our documentation is that if you wind up with an out of sync version like this, our recommendation would be to always push your current changes from inside of WireMock. So instead, do a push. We should see a similar error message. Let's go ahead and push that information to our GitHub repository, because then inside of GitHub, we have the facilities to actually see all of the tracked changes that are occurring. We can see what was the version, what was inside of GitHub when WireMock Cloud pushed it to GitHub, and then start to take a look at those changes and decide, well, which one is the right one that we want. Those facilities are well documented, well built into the GitHub ecosystem today. So that would be the recommendation. But as it was important, we can see that WireMock detected that there is both there are conflicting changes in WireMock Cloud versus what is stored in our source code control, and then asks you as a user, what would you like to do? And as I mentioned, inside of the documentation, you'll find a little bit of details, as I just explained here, on a recommended approach for handling those Git conflicts.
Awesome. And somebody did ask, following up on the Git question, do we know what the compatibility level with GitLab Enterprise is? So I responded in chat, but just to say it should work, as Dan was saying, either as is or would be a small amount of work to patch whatever the last mile of the difference is. If you want to get in touch on that or any other topic, so our emails are pretty simple. It's dan@wiremock.io or ethan@wiremock.io, and you'll also find them in the chat. Just shoot us an email and we'd be happy to take up that GitLab question with you as a follow-up and get really clear on what we need to do. All right, I've got another question for you, Dan. I know we only have a couple of minutes left. Does this work for all APIs on WireMock Cloud, or is this specific to open APIs?
Good question. Thanks, Ethan. So this functionality today is specific to the OpenAPI specific template. So this is an OpenAPI feature in its current form. We are currently collecting data points from our customers and potential customers on how important incorporating similar capabilities just into other areas of WireMock is to them. So if that is of interest, certainly let Ethan or myself know that you would like to see additional source code control mechanisms inside of WireMock Cloud that are just not specific to OpenAPI. We'd love to collect those data points and pass that along to our team.
Exactly. Oh, cool. Let's see. I got one more question. We'll see if we can sneak it in at the end. It looks like they're saying, I understand how a non-open API works on WireMock Cloud. You make the API, you make the stubs out of it. It looks like there's a slightly different abstraction when it's an open API. So can you maybe walk through what the relationship is with open API going to like stubs and the normal WireMock flow versus just a normal API?
Sure. So, one of the great things about the Open API specific functionality inside of WireMock Cloud is that capability of a relationship, a maintained relationship between the stubs and the Open API document. So, with the Open API flavor inside of WireMock, we can either start with an Open API contract and have the stubs automatically generated, which of course we can do that as well inside of a blank style Open API or mock API. But more importantly, on the Open API side, in addition to the Git sync, you see those capabilities for validation, right? Which allow us to take a contract testing approach, either with our mock APIs or even the live system. You can find some videos and some additional details inside of our academy, wiremock.io/academy, as well as our blog. in capabilities and how you can use that validation mode to make sure either against a mock API or even a live API once it's deployed that we are actually consuming and the mock or the live system is responding in a way that is actually meeting the definition, right? OpenAPI contract being the term. The contract's only good if it is actually being honored, not only by the consumers, but also by the producers. So validation mode is specific to OpenAPI as well. And the last piece I'll mention there is the mock first prototyping approach that has gained a lot of traction to, with our customers and everyone that we share the concept with, where instead of building an API schematic or definition on the whiteboard or over just talking over a Zoom call and walking away with no assets coming out of that initial design meeting, using WireMock Cloud to quickly prototype, like you saw in the demo today, where we had get contact 1, get contact 2, create contact 3, create contact 4, simply by specifying those 4 stubs inside of our mock API, coming out of a rapid design meeting, brainstorming session, our consumers walk away with a working mock that they can start to develop against and add their own data scenarios and edge case and negative scenarios. But also the producing team walks away with the beginning of an open API contract. And we've heard time and time again that that's a skill set in its own to generate open API contracts. A lot of people are still spending time hammering keyboards to get that done. And we can do that automatically with WireMock Cloud simply by providing a few examples of how this service should work to automatically generate that open API specification document, including detection of elements that are optional versus mandatory in the requests. And you couple that with the Git sync, and you can imagine a really nice workflow to enable parallelization of development of consumers and producers while detecting and avoiding drift much earlier.
I'm glad you mentioned the mock first prototyping. If you haven't heard us talk about that, we do have some good content on the website we'd recommend checking out, or you can get in touch. We definitely believe that having that mock at the start and using the mock to get that feedback quickly and iterate to inform the actual live API design. We've seen it again and again that it just helps you get features done so much faster and without all the late in the game API changes that anyone who's worked in software has experienced probably their entire career. And I think that's all the questions we had. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, like I said, Ethan at wiremock.io or Dan at wiremock.io, we will send these slides out after, and we'll be doing another one of these in, what is it, Dan, a few weeks, a month or so?
I believe it's 2 or 3 weeks from now, yes.
Okay, awesome. So hope to see you there, and thank you for stopping by. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.